So, Lily, thank you for taking the time. I am Craig Montuori. I'm one of the co-founders of the C19 Coalition. Do you want to start by introducing yourselves, Operation Masks, and
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me on. My name is Lily Liu. I'm one of the co-founders of Operation Mask. So for myself, the reason I kind of got involved was in a previous life, I built a 500-bed hospital in China. And for that, as a CFO, I built the building as well as bought all of the stuff that went into tertiary, acute care hospital. So I'd actually bought every single category of medical equipment in China before, and that was something that became relevant.
good. Yeah, one of the things we saw during the first week or so, it was really sudden, was the just obliteration of the traditional wholesaler uh, facilitated supply chain. That there were these four old school behemoths that all the hospitals just bought their standard package each month from. And all of a
Yeah,
sudden they said, we're done. Like we're out. It was gone in a day. And uh,
right.
so there needed to be essentially a reinvention of the supply chain. And I assume that was your similar call to action with Operation Masks, that like March 2020,
hmm
oh my God moment.
Yeah, it was just suddenly everything went poof right in the air, and it wasn't just PPE. I think really everything down the line. People's entire livings, right, were thrown into confusion. I mean, deeply confusing time and devastating time for so many people. So the way, I started looking at this is, because so first of all, I don't actually, blame necessarily a Medline or Cardinal or McKesson or these large organizations for not having really scenario plans for a a pandemic starting in the very epicenter of PPE production, right? That is not their fault. They are good at what they do, right? They have good product, all those sorts of things, and so I don't think it's right to really villainize them for that, right? Who business plans for that scenario? No one, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, myself, when I was working in China and actually buying a lot of this medical equipment, I did come across the Chinese arms of a number of these companies, right? Their business model is around they've got a couple of suppliers overseas, and then they identify them long-term contracts, and then they manage them over time. And so they're sort of their overseas presence is more focused on sort of farming, if you will, rather than hunting, right? So when it comes to I've really got to go find that incremental supplier and get to the front of the line when there's literally, trucks lined up outside of these factories fighting, almost physically fighting,
Mm-hmm.
right, to get goods
Mm-hmm.
in the gate. Let's just say you need a different skill set, right? Um, and you need different ways of sort of securing that access. And what we saw happening here on the U.S. side was you got all these people coming in the woodwork saying, I know a guy in China. Well, guess what? Of course you do, because it's 1.3 billion people. They manufacture probably half of the world's stuff, right? They export a whole bunch of stuff, and we buy a lot of it. So everyone knows a guy in China. And so you got to find a way of knowing who's actually legit and not. And during that time, right, there's then and even now, there's these crazy claims of, oh, a billion 3M 1860 masks, right? And what you had is you had a lot of people who, they don't really they've bought some stuff from China before, right? Okay, but they don't necessarily sort of kind of have a sense about, what makes sense in a supply chain and not, and would kind of fall for these types of claims out of desperation or whatever, that there's somehow a billion 3M 1860 masks sitting in a warehouse in LA, right? And why don't
Mm-hmm.
you just wire me some funds first for the privilege of coming to my warehouse to take a look, right? And so you can see how that probably didn't end well, really, ever. And what you kind of needed in the middle was, if your traditional suppliers couldn't get it done, right? Then finding other folks that could sort of help navigate this and would credibly actually have access to factories and actually be able to get goods and actually be able to deliver them. And so that was where we came in, and it turned out the need was, a little bit more fast and furious than we originally anticipated.
I'm reminded of that line that Ben Horowitz likes to reference, the wartime CEO.
Yes.
And it sounds like that was really that call to action, was to step up as a wartime operator and hunter rather
That's
than.
right. So So, my co-founder here on the US side, Robin, we were just joking about this yesterday that, how much we actually really enjoyed those 6 months of literally we worked every single day, Monday through Sunday calls with our team in China, worked around the clock to really sort of stand all of this up, and how much we actually enjoyed like the intensity and how much you can actually accomplish in a short amount of time. That was really the crunch, I would say, for from March until really September of last year. And I mean, there some just truly crazy stories that came out of that. At one point, our person on the ground in China actually got arrested.
Hmm.
Um, and
Wow.
uh, because there was such competition at the factory gates, what happens is that at 1, 2 a.m. is when the day's pickups happen.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so there's all sorts of people at the gate. Some of them actually have dream orders. Other people are there trying to sort of, bribe the people right out of the gate. And the other people are there who are just plain old thugs, right? Who are literally just trying to rob you as you drive your trucks away. So first you got to bring security. And then second of all, if, there's also, the kind of recognized faces, and if the new face shows up, they don't like that, right?
Hmm.
And so our person actually got sent to jail
Wow.
as we were in the process of picking up gowns for Illinois and Johns Hopkins. And so, unexpected issues. And then we were doing glove pickup for a hospital for Edward Elmhurst in Chicago. She actually got into a fist fight with
Hmm.
people as we were loading up our 2 million gloves. And so, that's some of the stuff that it took. So we kind of joked that, we had female bodyguards for for PPE.
I mean, at least he had the glove. They had the gloves for the fist
Yeah,
fight.
exactly.
Just for our viewers' sake, the one of the interesting bits of context with gloves is that all the attention had been focused on masks for months and months and months, and yet gloves really had become one of the key bottlenecks, almost behind the scenes or behind the curtain.
Yeah.
And so that there is so much, I'll say, kinetic energy around the gloves acquisition is not surprising, but potentially really interesting if you're learning about this.
Yeah. With a lot of PPE, what became very interesting about it and why it was so prone or is so prone to fraud is because it's this very kind of actually rare category where it's highly regulated, but it's really inexpensive product, right?
Hmm.
So what that means is that it's actually a lot easier it's a lot easier to fake, right? And it's really hard to get those certifications, especially when, inspectors are not traveling, so on and so forth. And so what it created is, if it's actually kind of easy, if you will, to create a glove because in the glove industry, first of all, it's a natural glove, a cheap item, right? Prior to this, it was 3 or 4 cents a glove. And there's also a big tradition in the glove industry around doing white label packaging, even though these are FDA Class 2, 510K regulated devices, right? So it's very rare that you have elsewhere this phenomenon where it's a Class 2 medical device, but it's actually a very cheap product, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
It's very easy to obscure provenance and so on and so forth because that is industry standard. And so that is really what has plagued the glove industry, really from when it got super hot in, I would say, June, July, just incredibly sophisticated fraud, right? You had people selling used gloves, if you can believe it. So there's just a lot of funny things happening there. And it was actually a lot easier to do that for gloves than it is for N95s because N95s, right, the packaging on them itself is
Hmm.
regulated, right? So it's easier to trace this packaging to the bill of lading to who actually produced it, whereas with gloves, it's practically impossible.
Your background as a CFO in understanding some of the financial flows, so money one way, product the other. Are there any just interesting stories about the financing side of things? We talk so much about the getting product from China or Southeast Asian countries into the U.S. and money
Yeah.
going the other way.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that was definitely something that was a challenge and actually something that C19 guys have been really amazing about because sort of trade finance is something that, is kind of provides all the liquidity of money flowing one way and products going the other way because the core thing in trade is, all right, well, it's a mutual trust issue, right? I want the money before I ship the goods, right? How do I know you're going to pay me? Well, I don't want to pay you until I get the goods because how do I know you're going to ship me the goods, right? And so, all of trade finance, very sophisticated industry, is there to basically de-risk that whole sort of mutual trust issue.
Hmm.
And the traditional kind of way it kind of works is that the factory will oftentimes take net terms, right? So you can take the goods, you build a relationship over time and they trust you enough, they'll give you net 30, net 60 terms, right? And that's what happens, with a lot of sort of long-standing relationships. Now, of course, when you go talk to a factory that overnight is one that has like the hottest product in the market, right? I mean, seriously, at one point, these N95s were even being used in international diplomacy.
Hmm.
If you remember, sort of, the Patriots flying their plane over
Yep.
to China to pick
Yep.
up masks, right? They were trading masks for, like serious sort of international favors here, right? So in that environment, the factory's not going to be taking net terms, right? If you give me cash, maybe I'll deliver you goods. It's basically what it turned into. And so if that's the case, then like your money's not even really worth anything, right? But table stakes is being able to pay before delivery. But then here on the U.S. side, certainly is a case that, I mean, there's barely any hospital that is used to paying anything, or government for that matter, is used to paying anything sort of more than net 30 terms. And so trying to bridge that gap, right? Where factories essentially prepay, and then the buyers here, especially large buyers, are used to net 30 and kind of stomach a 50% deposit. Really bridging that gap is what allowed a lot of the stuff to flow, right? And so that to me is really, the linchpin of being able to move a lot of this product and having sort of trusted intermediaries in between. And so having folks that were willing to work with us in basically providing trade credit, right,
Hmm.
was really valuable.
Great. And I guess the last question on this thread, we'll move on, is what changed when the governments got involved in directly purchasing? Whether that's international, like a French consortium, or individual states in the U.S., or even the federal government.
Yeah. Well, and there's certainly big buyers, and that helped. That helped quite a bit in sort of having lockdown demand, right? So, once a state government kind of writes you a PO that like they're committed,
Hmm.
and so that made it a lot easier. So for us, for example, we were able to make certain commitments in manufacturers that allowed us, for example, to bring up an entirely new line of N95s made by, there's I think about 13 manufacturers in China that make N95s. With that commitment, we were able to basically bring up an entirely new line in order to fulfill that order, right? And so that volume really matters. You make commitments to factories, and then they'll prioritize you.
Yeah.
Back then, the provenance of N95s, even now, is really a concern because it's a little bit harder to fake in a glove, and it's easier when you pick up a mask and you're like, is this real or fake? But there's still plenty of factories out there that make counterfeit masks, right?
Hmm. Now, looking at the C19 Coalition, we're just interested in how did Operation Masks become a partner, and how have you worked with us?
Yeah, for sure. You guys have been amazing. Robin, one of our co-founders here on the U.S. side, I think got pretty involved in the beginning
Hmm.
and helped sort of think about the need for something like a C19 coalition, right, to bring together a number of the credible parties that were really trying to very urgently fill this massive gap in supply. And so on the financing side, that was really critical for C19, enabled not just kind of, it really got a flywheel going for us, right? Enable a couple of deals, which generates kind of liquidity to help you continue to supply. So hugely helpful and really amplified sort of the impact of that. And then also C19, I think was working with Covered California
Hmm.
and California government. And so there's a big campaign of cloth masks done here in California by Cover California Health Insurance from the marketplace. And we partnered with them and produced 4.2 million cloth masks that a lot of people in California have seen on the street, which was kind of dovetailed with the insurance with the open enrollment period to also sort of the pun of get covered, stay covered, health
Hmm.
insurance coverage, and also sort of face coverage.
Thanks. Now looking ahead, what is Operation Masks top priorities. The immediacy of the COVID crisis. We're beginning to move into a post-vaccinated phase, but there's variants to consider. There's uneven vaccine distribution still.
Hmm.
What are your priorities, and where do you think the biggest need is at this point?
Yeah. Well, we've really been focused on supply chain from the beginning, particularly overseas sourcing, because that's, just the reality of where the existing supply base is. We'll see kind of what happens as the pandemic evolves. I think it's, hugely uncertain right now, what the impact the variants are going to have. And to an extent, we'll kind of know if as the variants kind of come. I'm hoping that we don't have something like, the Spanish flu 100 years ago, where they thought they were kind of in the clear, and then something sort of really, much more sort of infectious and deadly kind of showed up after about 18 months. So I'm hoping something like that doesn't happen. Rob and I, we kind of joke that this is a company we'd actually be very happy to shut down, because it means that there's no need for it, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so as long as there's continuing needs kind of on the supply chain side, and right now that continues to be sort of gloves, and then also syringes and needles and sort of sharps containers, no surprise related to vaccinations. The healthcare supply chain. Honestly, I was a little bit surprised to learn the healthcare supply chain for such a huge part of the U.S. economy, or 14% of the U.S. economy, uses some form of the stuff. And I kind of observed that it's if you compare it to like a retail supply chain or an auto supply chain, it's actually a little bit less sophisticated, right?
And is this something that helped inspire you to launch Aid in Health as well?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Mhm.
I think so. 'Cause, when you look, what we did observe is, so certainly the sort of national players, they do overseas sourcing, right? When you get to regional players, they basically don't at all, right? They
Mhm.
buy through a series of agents, even in the regular world, right? And so when we really sort of started to dig into the mass supply chain, right, and to sort of map out who's buying from who, there are already three layers deep by the time you get to, let's say, a regional supplier. And if you ask regional suppliers, you have like overseas kind of direct relationship with manufacturers, almost always no, right? And I found that to be somewhat surprising, because we do buy so much stuff overseas, right? If you look at the things that we consume and what percent of it or what percentage of that is bought overseas, like I would have presumed a more direct relationship. But then that also sort of made sense with what I had seen, a number of years ago, with sort of the role of some of these overseas organizations, even for the people who are best in business, right?
Mhm.
And so, I think that that's a potential for an evolution, of these supply chains, right? Into potentially sort of just buying direct, right? That's been an evolution in retail. It's been an evolution in the auto industry, and to me, makes sense that it would be an evolution in that direction as well.
And one thing I'll mention as the closing is C19. We spent the second half of the crisis really focused on underrepresented communities that were disproportionately affected. And as you mentioned, they are at the tail end of the supply chain,
Hmm.
and saw a lot of problems of substandard product deliveries, of scams, of lots and
Yep.
lots of middleman price inflation. And
Hmm.
the tribal nations, especially, started focusing on tribal communities, started focusing on direct buying for
Yep.
those reasons. So really excited to hear what you personally, what Operation Mass, and what Aid in Health get up to over the next 6 months,
Yeah.
12 months, and beyond.
Well, thank you. And what I would add in the underrepresented communities is there's certainly those communities we traditionally think of, but then there's also sort of what we call long tail medical, which is individual physicians' offices. Dentistry is a big part of that,
Yep. Yep.
and other sort of call it medical small business, which even now their supply is normalized a bit, but also suffer from the same things, right? Where provenance is doubtful, many layers sort of added on by the time they sort of have access. And that's also something that sort of made us think, is there a way that you can sort of more directly serve these folks, because you can for so many other categories of things that you buy these days.
Yeah. And during COVID, they didn't have the front line, therefore political representation and championing
Right.
to help cut through some of the red tape. And so, yeah, no, I completely agree. So, thank you for that insightful closing, and really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks for having me on.